Okay, so again, welcome to Growing a Self-Care Toolbox, Daily Practices for Calmer Living. So I want to start with a quote. Let me move this out of the way, the box of all of us, the gallery view. Let me start with a quote on resilience. And resilience as our natural impulse, something we have to work at, but that our bodies as organisms are already pre-programmed to really focus their energy on, just in terms of helping us survive. So this is from the book My Grandmother's Hands, a very popular book this year, dealing with racial trauma in the collective, race relations, by Resmaa Menakem. And he writes, resilience is built into the very cells of our body. It's as much a part of us as our ability to heal. Resilience can ripple outward, changing the lives of people, families, neighborhoods, and communities in positive ways. So while today is about developing a toolbox for ourselves, what I also want us to know and to remember is that as we heal ourselves and care for ourselves, that has ripples to the systems that we're part of. It ripples to all our relationships, this healing and centered self. It impacts our families, our neighborhoods, and our communities. So I want this to be the framing context that we'll use for today's conversation. So today's objectives include the following. First of all, to better understand the need for self-care and how our body responds to daily and past stressors. So basically the why bother, right? So secondly, we're going to identify some easy calming practices and mindfulness techniques to really enhance our well-being and the well-being of our loved ones, because we're always social and relational animals, aren't we? Thirdly, we're going to understand what meaningful respite means, taking a break from the stresses in our life, but doing it in a meaningful way to really help us sustain. We'll talk more about that. And finally, the overall objective is to increase the tools in our self-care toolbox, again, so we can support our own health, but also the health of others. Again, going to that resiliency in terms of the ripple effects. So in terms of a flow to meet those objectives, we'll start with a check-in survey, a self-check-in survey. How are we doing? Where are we in terms of our oxygen mask, which needs to go on us first before we go out into the world and support others in our work and our families. Understand stress and its impact on our bodies. And we'll go into those calming practices. We'll talk about the reframing of respite, and we'll end up, oh my goodness, sorry, we have a terrible thunderstorm somewhere, with those self-care practices. Did you hear that? Oh goodness. All right. So I use the analogy of the oxygen mask for ourselves, because as we show up for this life, and each of us are invited to, incited to, we really don't have much of a choice in terms of showing up. We want to survive. This is a marathon, right? It is a marathon that requires that we pace ourselves. So one of the things I learned in my parents' journeys was for 10 years, for a whole decade, I was just on fire, responding to one crisis after another. If we have children, if we have partners, even in our work, especially as younger folks in our 30s and 40s, that phone rings and we are on it, right? As with the adrenaline rush. If you do that over time, it really affects our bodies. So the oxygen mask has to go on first. We have to pause. We have to check in to see what is our oxygen level. And as our tank gets depleted, we have to get support to increase that oxygen. So I want us to think about the two things, resiliency and the ripple effects that we started with in terms of that quote, and then the oxygen mask as the analogy for what we must do to sustain ourselves in this marathon. So in this great book by Deepak Chopra and Dr. Rudolph Tanzi, Dr. Rudolph Tanzi is in the Massachusetts General Hospital field of neurosciences. He's a brain science doctor. They've written a book called The Healthy Self. They've written many books together, but this is one of the most recent. And they have this check-in survey that we won't go through the whole thing because of time, but it's in the resource list in the toolbox that we'll go over at the end of this conversation. But I want us to just choose a couple of these. And it's really good to do these, I'd say, a couple times a month. So excuse me again, because it's a terrible thunderstorm. So I hope if you hear it in the background, it's not too distracting. So there's a Likert scale that's used here from 1 to 4. And what they're asking us to do, we'll do together, is to look, to read each sentence and then reflect, you know, can even write it down for ourselves or just in our own minds, reflect on a scale of 1 to 4, you know, how it pertains to us. 1 is not at all or once at most. 2 is sometimes, 3 is fairly often, and 4 is often. So where are we today? Consider your experience for this past month. Okay, how often has this experience occurred in our lives? All right, so the first one was I was depressed. So again, Likert scale from 1 to 4. Second, I felt worried and anxious. Third, I had to go to the doctor's office. I was in pain but didn't go to the doctor's office. I was under pressure. I felt stressed out. I had trouble getting to sleep. I didn't get enough sleep. I had a headache. I had a backache. My relationship didn't go well. I get seriously angry. I neglected exercise and physical activity. I felt lonely. I felt uncared, or I felt unloved or uncared for. I was worried about the future. So you see how this is really a wonderful way to check in on all the different dimensions of well-being. So we're checking in here about our physical well-being, but also about our mental and emotional well-being. Now, I love this part of the quiz, part 2, this self-assessment. This is your highest positive experiences. So here the glass is half full. The others, the glass is half empty, right? So for each question, consider your experience in the past month again, and mark according to how often you've had this experience. Again, using the same Likert scale, 1 to 4. 1, not at all, or once at most. 2, sometimes. 3, fairly often, and 4, often. Now check these out. These are very different. I felt contented inside. I expressed love openly to someone else. I felt free and liberated. I saw myself without blame or judgment. I was appreciated and praised by someone at work or in my family. I felt inner peace and tranquility. I felt myself to be part of a larger plan or vision. Let's look at a few more of these. Again, we won't go through all of them. I had a spiritual experience. I forgave myself. I sensed what I call a divine or holy presence. I was lighthearted. I felt blissful or ecstatic. I saw or experienced inner light. So these are very different, right, than the first cluster. But you can see they're still helping us assess our well-being, where we're at. This case, a little bit more of the spiritual sensibilities, a little bit more, again, focusing on the glass half full. So you can see the source here, the Healing Self by Dr. Deepak Chopra and Dr. Rudolph Tanzi. There's a few more here. I meditated, prayed, or did another contemplative practice. I felt creatively inspired. So creativity is also part of that well-being that we want to cultivate and to cultivate in our wellness practices. So I'm just going to move the gallery over one more time so I can see the very edge. There we go. So what's really key also to this self-care toolbox is we may not think of ourselves as caregivers as I first started speaking about it, but we are definitely all in relationship. And what that means, especially in a gendered society, like all societies, but especially where women are oftentimes positioned to be caregivers, sometimes, well, many times we get stressed because of that role. Men also have caregiving responsibilities, especially older men. But in general, for much of our life, it's the woman in our society that's positioned as a caregiver. So we want to check in on our relationships and our role, again, as the caregiver or provider. So what is the definition of a caregiver, or now we're saying care partner? It's someone who provides for another person. So I would wager that when we go through that self-assessment, when we start checking our oxygen level, a lot of what we come up with has to do with our relationships with other people, with children, with aging parents, with partners or spouses, even relatives, friends, and neighbors. We may also be a paid professional who gives care. So I'm in the world of dementia, so I consider myself a caregiver or a care partner in my professional world, as well as being a mother to a daughter who's actually pregnant. So I see myself as a care partner, again, both personally and professionally. So part of that oxygen mask, engaging our oxygen level, is looking at our relationships and to see where does our energy go in terms of those relationships and in terms of the caring. Where does our energy get spent? So we could be paid professionals caring, informal caregivers. Again, I mentioned the gender piece of it. Many of us are juggling, and this is really important when we assess our oxygen level. Nearly 3 in 5 family caregivers have paid jobs in addition to their caregiving. So while I was trying to support my parents for that decade, as I mentioned, I was also teaching, and my daughter was a middle school child, and then in high school. And many of you here, I know, are in a similar situation. You're in the sandwich generation. You're supporting your older parents and relatives, neighbors, as well as the children in your lives. So how do the causes of stress show up? Why, again, is this toolbox for self-care so important? We experience stress emotionally, but also physically. Many of us are on call 24/7. Sometimes this caring, our relationships are actually traumatizing because of the crises that we're constantly showing up for. Part of the assessment of the oxygen level, the oxygen mask, is asking ourselves, where do we feel overwhelmed? So the word trauma itself is triggering, right? So let's substitute out for trauma, stressed and overwhelmed, because actually the definition of trauma is something that overwhelms us. There can be a traumatic event, and one individual may not feel overwhelmed and may be able to respond to it in a very healthy, centered way and not be traumatized, while someone else could be totally overwhelmed and paralyzed by that same event. So let's start in our own lives identifying the causes of stress. That's the very first point before we actually get to the tools in our toolbox, is we're still in the assessment stage. I'm just going to pause. Are there any comments or questions in terms of this oxygen mask analogy? Any thoughts? Okay, we'll go on. So be sure to put in the chat any thoughts or questions as they come up. So some signs of stress in our own lives, some signs that our oxygen mask, our oxygen level is becoming depleted, include the following. Are we frustrated? Are we feeling angry, helpless? Are we feeling overwhelmed, as I mentioned before? Are we feeling tired? Are we getting headaches or body aches often? I had sciatica this winter, and I'm being trained as a trauma practitioner. And one of my trainers said, is there any stress? Asked me if there was any stress in my life. And I was like, what? And they said, yes, sometimes sciatica actually manifests itself, shows itself in people's lives when they've either had stress in the recent, in the past few days or few weeks, or they had stress like within the past year, and it was repressed. They had to soldier on. They weren't able to deal with it immediately. So are we having any aches or bodies? Is our body talking to us, trying to communicate to us in terms of that oxygen level? Is our immune system weakening? Are we having difficulty with obesity, overeating, or sometimes undereating? Dr. Deepak Chopra and Dr. Tanzi, in that book, Healthy Self, they talk about inflammation. This really changed my life also. Inflammation being the root cause of almost all chronic diseases, including dementia, arthritis, diabetes, And inflammation, guess what is the root cause of that? Is stress. So I know we're doing a lot on the assessment, the foundational work before we actually get to our toolbox, but this inflammation and reducing stress causing the inflammation is really fundamental to the self-care. Also, memory and focusing difficulties can be symptoms of stress as well. So this is a complicated chart, but I love it because you can study it later. And so this is actually the polyvagal theory becoming very, very popular as we have conversations about individual and collective trauma. But basically, it's a chart that shows what happens to our nervous system under stress. And this is really important because when we get to the toolbox, the tools that we're going to introduce are tools that help us reduce the stress. And if we understand the theory behind the stress reduction, we understand what's happening to our nervous system as we calm it down. So I won't spend too much time on it. You'll have it here to refer to later. But Dr. Stephen Porges is the doctor who created this, and a lot of people refer to it. But you'll see the green, red, and blue strips or zones. These are the zones in our nervous system. When the nervous system is calm, we're at the bottom level here, the green level. I call it the garden level. We're chill, we're relaxing in the garden. When our system is calm, we're able to experience compassion, curiosity, and openness. We're not rigid. We can be really in the present and grounded. The other important indicator of being in this garden zone is that we feel connected to one another and open to communication. So think of ourselves during the day. I think when we get frustrated, when we get stressed, we start to move from this garden zone, the green zone, to the red zone, right? Our nervous system starts to get activated, and we go into fight or flight mode. We can respond, we become reactive, right? Sometimes we talk about the reptilian brain. We become irritated or frustrated, angry. We either want to run away from the stressor that's imposing itself on us, or we want to fight. But we are charged, our adrenaline's charged one way or another. So think of a time, you can put it in the chat or you can share it verbally, but think of a time recently or an example where you went from that garden mode, I call it the hammock mode, where we're just so relaxed in that hammock and open to all our environment. And then something happened and we jumped from there to the red zone, the fight or flight zone. Does anyone have an example of that? I could think of an example. I drive a lot between Maryland and Massachusetts, and I love driving. And one example would be just listening to my favorite music, going along a beautiful strip of, maybe the New Jersey Turnpike, maybe the Merritt Parkway, which is really like a garden strip. So I'm chill and I'm listening to my 1970s music, folk music, and then suddenly maybe a car cuts me off, comes from nowhere. Immediately, right? My nervous system is jarred. I am thrown out of my hammock, and just to survive, I have to pivot, right? Immediately. But what usually happens to us, we usually get really angry, don't we? And we have to be reactive for self-preservation, but it's hard to just go back to that hammock mode after we've almost lost our life, isn't it? But we can, if we check in with the body, we can see how our nervous system has become activated. Another activation element is called freeze. So fight, flight, or freeze. And this is in response again to an external impulse or activation, and our nervous system goes immediately from that garden state to this blue zone. So we can shut down, we can sometimes feel trapped or helpless, sometimes we disassociate, but what happens is that our heart rate and our blood pressure really changes its mode. from that relaxed green garden state. In the red state, the heart rate increases, the adrenaline, as in the car example, picks up, kicks in. In the freeze state, the opposite happens. We go down, but neither the red nor the blue is healthy. Now, when we get to the toolkit's function or purpose is to take our nervous system and to bring us out of the blue zone, out of the red zone, down into that garden state, into that hammock. So again, I didn't want to get too academic, but I think it's really important to understand what happens to us physiologically because of these stressors in our day-to-day life, because of our commitments, and because of our need to soldier on during crises. Oh my God. Sorry, there's thunder. Talk about the activation. Here I am going into the red zone naturally because of this terrible thunderstorm. So what I need to do together with you is to bring myself back down to this green zone. So this is a perfect opportunity. All right, here's another depiction, and I think it's can you see it all? Oops. I like this one as well. So this is a similar, another way of looking at the same thing. And this is almost reversed. So here we're on the ladder of our day-to-day activities, and you can see the different stressors. At the very top is the garden zone. Ta-da, we're fine, we're balanced. We are able to stay on this ladder. Look, no hands, Mom. We are really centered. And then what happens is we get cut off by a car, or here in my home, this startling lightning, or we get a call saying that our child or our loved one is in trouble. And we start, you see, to shake a little bit, right? We need to hold on at least with one hand. We're off center, not quite so stable. And then, of course, we go into the deep red zone or that freeze zone, and our nervous system is down for the count. So this is another way, maybe a simpler way, but I really like this as a way to check in with our oxygen level because of that, using that survey, but also thinking, where are we on our ladder? How stable are we on that ladder? And, if we're not very stable, boy, we better call out to use our toolbox. Okay, so let's go to that. Choosing health. How do we build resiliency? Now we've done the assessment, and we're looking at our toolbox. This is a recipe for the mind, body, and I added spirit health here because even if don't see ourselves as religious with a big R, all of us have a spirit being. It's a universal element of being human, and it's not often in our mainstream society considered that important. But what I've seen, I'm a sociologist by training, and sociologist and anthropologist, and what I've learned is that across all cultures, there are rituals to help us maintain our spiritual health, our spirit being as well. So some of these are familiar suspects, right? We've all become familiar now with the Mediterranean diet, rich in vegetables, low in red meat, high in fish and olive oil. The second element is really important. And this is adequate sleep, 7 or 8 hours. And this was also an important piece that changed my life when I heard Dr. Rudolph Tanzi and Dr. Chopra speak at WGBH. They had a lecture series. And one of the things they said is, especially for brain health and inflammation, is that if we don't get adequate sleep as adults, 7 or 8 hours, our brain doesn't have the opportunity to actually scrub. It scrubs clean when it goes through the deep stages. And so dementia and memory issues, other cognitive issues can arise because of inadequate sleep. I'll give you an example. I was writing my dissertation. I pulled all-nighters because 30-year-olds can do that, I thought. I got in my car. I went to the printer to drop off my dissertation. I hadn't slept for like 3 or 4 days. I got in my car, I drove away, and I had an accident. I didn't even know what hit me, literally. And later I learned that actually my brain had shut off. My brain was sleeping while my eyes were open and I was driving. No one was hurt, but this is an example of what happens when we don't get adequate sleep. We just cannot function. And most importantly, it increases inflammation. So if you think about all the chronic diseases that are impacting us, especially as we get older, you want to make sure that sleep is a priority. So, I quit some of my jobs. I was a workaholic after that accident. I quit my jobs and I made sleeping a priority. Daily exercise, also we're more familiar with that, right? Cultivating a sense of humor. This is new to me as well. And the research is showing that we can actually trick our bodies into being happy. One of the links in our resource list, in our toolbox, is laughter yoga. Have any of you done laughter yoga? It actually started in India. It is wonderful. Started in India, and some of the Indian police forces, many of them are actually trained in this. And we won't do a deep dive into any of these, but if you're interested in the future, we could do a course or a class on it. But the link, you can do it also on YouTube. What you do is you actually start laughing as an individual, but also as a group. And they're doing this online now, virtually. And what happens physiologically is your body suddenly believes that it's laughing, and the nervous system starts relaxing, and physiological changes happen that resonate with the different measures of joy and happiness. Can you believe it? So it sounds totally crazy, but when I was going through my sciatica example, I would take walks around my neighborhood and I would do the laughter yoga. I would make myself laugh out loud, and I know the neighbors thought I was nuts. I didn't care because I knew that my body was responding to this humor that I was tricking it into because of laughter yoga. And again, you'll see the link. It's really amazing. There are mindfulness practices. We talked about the spirit health, right? So if we're religious with a big R, the prayer or chanting is really important. Now there's also a lot of research. They have wired religious folks ranging in faith. So the Dalai Lama and some of the Buddhist monks have participated, have offered to be wired while they meditated. Also nuns, Catholic nuns, have been wired while they prayed in medical scientific settings, and they can actually show the physiological change and health outcomes of the mindfulness practices across these different faith traditions. Learn new things. I think we're pretty much familiar with that. Learning new languages or new games. Staying socially engaged. Now, this is really important in terms of our toolbox. There's also research indicating, this is crazy, that social isolation actually decreases longevity more than living with diabetes or smoking. Isn't that incredible? So if you think what happened during COVID, when so many of us were isolated, especially older folks, but all of us, I wouldn't say that all of us, our longevity was reduced, but we know across the country that mental health issues were increased. I saw, because I did I used virtual programming to do support groups. I saw folks who were living with Parkinson's and other kinds of diseases really suffer during the isolation because they couldn't get out and they couldn't experience social engagement very easily. So social isolation is really, really important to watch out for in terms of our toolbox. Sense of purpose. I love this one. So maybe you're familiar with this research called the Blue Zones research. National Geographic years ago funded this research where they sent researchers around the world to identify the communities where the most 100-year-olds live, the centurions. And these places included Costa Rica, Okinawa, a couple places here in the US. Anyway, the researchers interviewed the 100-plus-year-olds to find out what's the secret to longevity. And they found a lot of the things here: Mediterranean diet or good diet, walking. Those are the usual things that we know about. But one of the surprises, and I'll never forget it, is the sense of purpose. An Okinawan woman, it's translated, of course, but she said, it's so profound to me. She said, every morning I awaken knowing that I'm loved and expected to love. So what's really important in our toolbox is trying to identify what our purpose is. You know, so we're eating well, we're exercising well, we're praying or meditating, yes, but we all have to discover what our meaning and purpose is, and it changes with different stages in life, right? But that's something that we don't talk an awful lot about in our culture here in America. Um, let's see, and I can't see the bottom one. What is the bottom one? Can someone tell me, because it's blocked with my screen here?
Counseling.
Well, yeah, thank you. Counseling, right. And so that's the other support that at least the older generation, counseling wasn't in their repertoire. But today, thank goodness, because of more awareness, and Simone Biles, for example, during the Olympics was a real great champion of this. Mental health is so important, and getting the supports that we need is so important. So counseling is definitely in this toolbox mix. And it can be, it doesn't have to be deep psychoanalysis, you know, it could be someone from the faith community, it could be pastoral counseling, but this is also related to that social isolation piece. Make sure that we're not struggling, and we all do struggle at sometimes, but make sure that we're not alone, that we do share that, and are not too ashamed to let other people know we're struggling. And I'm not happy that Simone Biles, for example, was struggling, but I am so pleased that she had the courage to speak to us all from the Olympic arena and say, you know what, self-care is what's important to me. And in my toolbox today is my decision, you know, to take care of myself and to not allow the stress to break me. So actually, she's an example of all that we're talking about today. So to live in a mindful way, let me just pause. Any comments or questions before we go on to the next piece? How are we doing? Okay? All right. Part of the toolbox and self-care practice is mindfulness, living mindfully. And let's look at one of the definitions. This is given by John Kabat-Zinn. I don't know if you know about him. He's remarkable. He teaches about meditation for any situation, but his specialty is living with chronic pain. And I actually went to a hospital program where he taught here in Massachusetts, but now you can get his work online. So for folks for whom medication hasn't worked, for folks, and a lot of us live with a chronic pain, there's another way to deal with it, and that's through meditation and mindfulness. He defines mindfulness as the awareness that arises through paying attention on purpose. So it's a deliberate choice in the present moment, non-judgmentally. And he says, sometimes he adds, in the service of self-understanding and wisdom. And there's many ways to practice this mindfulness, this non-judgmental showing up for the present. So if you go back to that chart that I showed you, this is a way to cultivate staying in that garden green, right? As a nervous system, staying centered on that ladder, no matter what happens. If the ladder starts to shake, we as a mindful practitioner can stay centered and safe on that ladder. So through meditation, yoga, singing, prayer, and more, we can practice this mindfulness. So all the different practices of mindfulness have similar characteristics. So this is what's happening when we do even the laughter yoga. We slow down, which is so important. There's a great book that you might want to look at called Thank You for Being Late by Thomas Friedman, famous social scientist. And he says that the time we're living in right now is this time of many accelerations. But we are going so fast with our technology, faster than any other time in history. And he says, as organisms, we can't sustain this acceleration. It's technology driven, and of course, there are so many miracles with it. But he asks the sobering question at the end, who is left behind as we continue this acceleration? So for me, I'm especially aware of folks who are slower due to dementia or other cognitive challenges. But think of our own nervous system during the day when we're running on roller skates from one thing to another. And things are so complicated. The other day, I went to buy stamps to mail a letter. I had to figure out how to navigate, the automated pay system, for the parking. I couldn't remember my license. I had to go back and get my license plate. And then anyway, and I was racing. And I could just check it. I checked in with my nervous system and I could feel it going from that garden green state up to that red state. So the characteristics of the mindfulness wanted to keep us in the green state, as I said, slows us down, helps us to be present, helps keep us from fearing about the future and also longing for the past. So if we're in the present zone, sometimes it's called the flow. In psychology, it's called the flow, where everything else drops away and we're totally focused on the present. There are physical effects that are really positive. Our stress is reduced, our heart rate slows, our anxiety is reduced, our brain rests, and getting back to the inflammation is reduced as well. So these practices in our toolbox are really trying to help us be more mindful. And John Kabat-Zinn is one of the quintessential gurus of this mindfulness, and he actually assisted in the toolbox later. All right, let's look a little bit further at what some of these calming mindfulness practices include for you and also your loved ones. So the first cluster I have called somatic practices. So I'm in training to become a trauma practitioner, as I mentioned. And there's a certain school of training called somatic experiences, or SE. But this is a broad genre that focuses on the body. And it also starts from the fundamental thesis or premise that the body is intelligent. And the body, going back to that definition of resilience, the body wants to be healthy, wants to survive. So its natural intelligence is toward well-being and health. So every day, the somatic practices include mindfulness meditation, prayer, chanting, walking, and also attunement to our body in 3 different ways. So if we're meditating, we want to focus on the 3 sync meditation, asking ourselves, how is my body feeling? Where am I holding tension? And again, we could do sessions on these in the future if you're interested, but in that toolbox, I have links to them as well. Along with the body and the tension and the tightness, also, where is my body comfortable? So the body is complex. For me, for example, I hold a lot of tension in my gut, but I'm very relaxed in my hands and my feet. So if we start to feel stressed, we check in with our body. We do through this 3 sync awareness. How is my body feeling? Where is it tense, but also where is it relaxed? And we give that space just through a deep breath, just through awareness. Again, going back to the John Kabat-Zinn definition of mindfulness, without judgment. One of the ways I think of mindfulness was offered to me by a teacher who talked about it as the weather. We can notice a tightness maybe in our gut or our chest, and we take a deep breath, and we know it's just like the clouds coming and going. It's going to change. We don't get frightened about it. We give it space. We give it curiosity. And you know what? Invariably, it dissipates. So in the 3 sync meditation or focus, we want to look at the body. We also want to just pay attention with awareness to our thoughts, but again, without judgment. So that's tricky, isn't it? I don't know about you, but I'm very harsh. Most of us are the harshest critics on ourselves. So what am I thinking? Well, maybe I notice I'm grumpy, but without shaming, saying, oh, there you go again, you're grumpy. No, just noticing again, the grumpy cloud, it's coming. Well, I have that thought about a relative or whatever. I give it space and then it goes. Also our emotions, well, I just gave an example of a conflation, the thought and the emotion. But how are we feeling in our emotions? What are our thoughts around it? And what is our body saying? The 3 sync meditation is really important. Many of us here on the call live in the world of ideas. For me, I was an academic. My body served me as an athlete, but I really wasn't in touch with it in terms of this mindfulness. And in terms of resource of meditation, what that means is using our body as a source of comfort and joy. So if externally there's a crisis, we can take a deep breath and find in our body that place of relaxation. Maybe it's just, Let's see, it could be in our neck, or we could even focus on the forehead and relax the forehead. This focus brings us to that experience of flow that I talked about a moment ago, where the external crisis drops away and we can source in ourselves to find joy and comfort and strength. There are other ways to meditate, of course, besides our own body, and this is using music. Sometimes if I come out of a stressful meeting at work, I put on my earbuds and I go into YouTube and I choose relaxing music. Today it was Baroque music, and that was a meditation, for a few minutes, just to help me focus on joy, using the music as a focus. Color is another way. Sometimes when I did my support groups during COVID, especially in the long-term care facilities, folks in assisted living, I would have just colors, almost psychedelic colors sometimes, or rich forest colors on the screen with music playing. And we would just sit looking at that for maybe 20 minutes. And when I asked folks, how are you feeling? They were definitely down in that green level, that garden level of the nervous system, so relaxed. Visualization is another source in our toolbox that we can take wherever we are. When I was on the train the other day, going from Massachusetts to Maryland, it was so crowded and people were yelling. And what I ended up doing was putting on my earbuds and actually taking myself to my favorite place in the mountains. Any of us, anywhere can do this. We take ourselves to a favorite place, so we focus on a favorite person, whether alive or past, or a favorite thing. We can even look around our environment, our little nest, I say right here, choose something that brings us comfort and joy, and just focus on that. And take a deep breath, and it's amazing how already we can go from that red zone to the green zone in our nervous system. Now, I mentioned laughter yoga. That's another practice. And self-Reiki. So as I said, I'm a Reiki master. Usually we think of Reiki as energy healing or light touch healing for other people. But part of Reiki is self-Reiki. And there's a simple protocol of laying our hands on our head and our eyes and our shoulders, and you can learn it easily. And with each touch, each location, you take a deep breath. And it's amazing how that too will calm our nervous system, bringing it from freeze, fight or flight, down to that green garden zone. So another aspect of our toolbox is taking a break from the stressors, actually getting away. And this is key to resiliency. So some of those mindfulness exercises help us for sure, but also seeking respite opportunities. So the traditional definition for respite is a short break, right? And there's actually international movement around respite, mostly for caregivers, but I like the term respite even for all of us, whether we see ourselves as caregivers or not, on statewide movements as well. And there's some research on respite that says that if we do simply the traditional respite, which means we get away from whatever stress is stressing us, and, if we're taking care of a loved one, we use, whether it's a child, going to a daycare program, or an older adult going to a social day program, that gives us a break and that helps our nervous system calm. But what's even more important is what I'm calling restorative respite, which means that sometimes we're still taking a break from our ordinary activity, but we're still with our loved ones, our partners or our child or our parents. And we're doing something fun, something joyful, and we're doing it together. But we're getting outside, even a mini vacation. What I mean by that is maybe going to a local garden, a local park, and sitting on a bench and just focusing on the birds for a little bit. But respite is really, really important. It changes the environment. So many of our environments are stressful and toxic, that this concept of respite is really key for and central to our toolbox. Let's see. I want to share with you this research. This professor, Dr. Dale Lund, found that when we take a break and we leave our stressors, if we just take care of business, so for example, pay the bills or clean our house, sometimes we can actually become more depressed. We can we don't really get restored in terms of our toolbox. What we need to do, he suggests, is during our respite time, do something that brings us joy, perhaps something that we've put aside because we're dealing with our stress. So for me, for example, I love writing short stories. And when I'm stressed, when I'm supporting my parents or my daughter, helping her with her college applications, and I take a break from that to pay my bills or to clean the house, he's saying that's not restorative, actually. And in terms of my nervous system, it doesn't help me, recharge. Instead, what would help me is if I went off and wrote a short story or dedicated at least an hour a day or an hour every few days to doing something that I loved, oftentimes something that we've had to let go of because of other responsibility. So I share this with us as a central piece of our toolbox to think about what brings us joy. What has in the past that we've let go of because of our stressors, because of our obligations, or what might bring us joy, something that we've wanted to learn or do, maybe even go on a bike ride and we haven't done that for months. So this respite redefined, I think, is a really key piece of the self-care. Finding those places that are restorative and those opportunities that are restorative for us as individuals, but also in our relationships. So now we start to look at some of the resources that I've mentioned. So here we have the first one, which is a link to John Kabat-Zinn in terms of stress reduction and pain management. We also have a link to the book I talked about, The Healthy Self, in which you'll find that survey that we went too quickly over, but that I introduced in the beginning of this. The Body Keeps a Score is really key to understanding how trauma is stored in our body our whole lives and how we can slowly heal that trauma, which is part of that self-care. Again, rethinking trauma as what's been overwhelming for us in our lives, and moving away from the traditional notion of that word trauma. Healing back pain, I talked about sciatica. Here's the book that I refer to. I don't know if I gave the title earlier tonight, but it's called Healing Back Pain by John Sarno. His thesis is that there's something blocked in our mind-body relationship. There's some tension that's held in our nervous system that is creating a lot of our nervous pain. The Unspoken Voice is by Peter Levine, and he is the founder of this whole somatic experiences and the 3 sync meditation that I spoke about. I'll stop there. Here is my email and my phone number. I'd be happy to connect with any and all of you. And I know also there's a resource list that I shared with the library, and we can talk about some of that if we have time. Otherwise, that will be posted as well.